Good morning. This is the Mack Church of Christ Sunday Samuel to Chronicle study. Today we're in 1 Samuel chapter 29, starting at verse 1. Let me just show you the little chart that I always show you to kind of give us a big picture of the book of Samuel. Samuel, of course, it records the end of Samuel the prophet and the beginning and the life of Samuel, and then how Samuel anoints Saul to be king, and then how Saul is rejected from being king. And then David is picked. And then we see the decline of Saul's reign and the increase of David's reign. But we also see that David has to flee and hide in exile. And so that's what you have here. You have the main characters that are up here, Samuel, Saul, and David. Over here, you have the priest Eli, who was the priest during that time, at least for the first 4 chapters. You have the birth and call of Samuel here, and then you have the judgeship of Samuel there. Then he appoints the king, and then we have Samuel's later ministry. Here you have the reign of Saul and the fact that God made Saul king, but then you notice that God rejects him and his reign starts to decline. And during that time that his reign is declining, God picks David to be king, and Saul gets jealous of David, and David then has to flee in exile after spending some time with Saul as one of his most loyal officers. And now we're over here in chapter 29, where we find David fleeing from Saul. And of course, David is not Saul's enemy, but Saul is David's enemy. And Saul looks at David as if David is his enemy, but David is not Saul's enemy and in no way wants to harm him. Matter of fact, there were 2 times that David could have harmed him and didn't harm him. And so it's important for us to realize that Saul is viewing David as an enemy, but David is not. David never wanted to usurp the throne from him, never wanted to kill him in order to take it over. David has been faithful to the Lord, and even when he had opportunities, he didn't do it. Again, forgive me, I'm fighting a little bit of allergies. But in 1 Samuel 29, we see that going to turn from Saul's story for just a minute, because in chapter 28, what we noticed is that Saul, who wanted to find out what God had for him because he was going to have this battle with the Philistines, went and spoke to a medium at Endor and called up Samuel. And Samuel basically said to him, if you remember last week's lesson, that if God isn't talking to you, what makes you think that I'm going to be able to communicate with you? And so Saul was upset, and the witch at Endor, the medium at Endor, then gave him something to eat. And Saul then arose and went to his house. In the meantime, that's happening, that Saul is at Endor and trying to figure out what to do with the Philistines that are coming out to fight against him, since God has left him and is not communicating with him anymore. And it's always important for us that whenever we begin a venture or a fight or a struggle with somebody or something, that we always go to God in prayer and look for God's guidance as we study the Word of God. And so basically what we have here is, what is David going to do during the time that the Philistines were coming to fight against Saul? We saw what Saul did. Saul went and tried to get help from God, but God wasn't talking to him by priest or by Urim or even Samuel, when Samuel was called forth by the medium, which, by the way, is not usually the things that mediums can do. But God allowed Saul to become visible at that time, or Samuel to become visible to Saul, so that he could communicate with him through Saul or through Samuel, and basically tell him that he's not communicating with him, which is kind of funny to me, that he allows Samuel to be raised and come and talk to David. And basically Samuel says that God's not talking to you, and neither am I. But anyway, in the meantime, while Saul is doing that to prepare for the fight against the Philistines, what is David doing? Well, David, remember, lives in the area of the Philistines because he is being pursued by Saul, and Saul won't come into the land of the Philistines. And so David finds himself safe there. Now, in the meantime, David has been raiding the pockets of resistance that are in Judah and in the area. And David is slowly removing those pockets of resistance that have been there since, you might say, children of Israel first entered the land of Canaan. And he makes sure and kills everybody so that nobody knows exactly what he's doing. And so when he's asked, he says that he's, raiding against Israel. And in a way he is. He's going into the land of Israel, but he's not fighting against the Israelites, but those pockets of resistance that had remained in there. But anyway, I say all that because what we have here in chapter 29 is we have what David's going to do when the Philistines fight, because one of the commanders of the Philistines, Achish, is over, you might say, is over David, and so he considers David one of his groups of armies, you might say, and so he's going to call him for this battle, and that's what we have here in chapter 29. So let's see what David does, or let's see what happens during this time. Now, in chapter 29, verse 1, it says, "Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, while the Israelites were camping by the spring, which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines were proceeding on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were proceeding on in the rear with Achish. Then the commanders of the Philistines said, 'What are these Hebrews doing here?' And Achish said to the commander of the Philistines, 'Is this not David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who has been with me these days, or rather these years, and I have found no fault in him from the day he deserted to me to this day?' But the commander of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, 'Make the man go back, that he may return to his place where you have assigned him, and do not let him go down to battle with us, or in the battle he may become an adversary to us. For with what could this man make himself acceptable to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of these men? Is this not David, of whom they sing in the dances, saying, Saul has slain his 1,000 and David his 10,000s? Then Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives, you have been upright, and you're going out and you're coming in with me in the army are pleasing in my sight. For I have not found evil in you from the days of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, you are not pleasing in the sight of the Lord's. Now, therefore, return and go in peace, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines. And David said to Achish, well, what have I done? And what have you found in your servant from this day when I came before you to this day, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the Philistines? But Achish replied to David, I know that you are pleasing in my sight, like an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, he must not go up with us to the battle. Now then arise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who have come with you, and as soon as you have arisen early in the morning and have light, depart. So David arose early, he and his men, to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went to Jezreel. So I read the whole chapter. It's not really long. It's only 11 verses, but I read it for us so that we could kind of get an insight of what's going on here. So Saul went to the witch at Endor, or the medium at Endor, for the purpose of getting God's help to fight against the Philistines. Meanwhile, the Philistines are all gathering together in order to go fight against Saul. And it says in verse 1, now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, while the Israelites were camping by the spring, which is in Jezreel. So basically what that means is that you have one side, you have Jezreel, and the other side you have Aphek. And basically the two armies are being stationed there so that they can then come together and fight in the valley or in the middle, you might say. And so as Saul had gone to ask of the medium, to try to contact God about this battle and whether he was going to win it or not, the Philistines are getting ready for the battle. And so they're calling all of their different men. Now remember, basically how that worked was that the Philistines didn't have what you might call a standing army. other than maybe a small one. But the Philistines, like Israel, basically had rulers of cities, and each of those cities had their own armies, you might say. And so therefore, when the Philistines would go out to fight, the Philistine king or commander would call all of the other city lords or lords of the cities that they were over to bring their fighting men, and that's the army that's under consideration. And so that's what they're doing. So all of the armies are coming out to Jezreel so if they can come fight against Israel. In verse 2, it says, and the lords of the Philistines were proceeding on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were proceeding on in the rear with Achish. So as you might suspect, a commander would like to know how many men he has in his army. And so he's, basically letting each group go through and basically kind of taking account of them so that he'll know how many men he has and, how many men are coming that he's going to fight against. You certainly would always like to have the larger force when you're going out to battle somewhere. And so that's what he's doing. He's looking at his army in order to see who's there. And in the back was coming Achish. Achish apparently was bringing up the rear. And along with Achish was David and David and his men. And remember that the scripture said that David had at least 600 men that followed him that were men of war. And so apparently they all came, beckoned by Achish. And so his men were proceeding in the rear. And it says, then the commanders of the Philistines said, what are these Hebrews doing here? Now remember, they're going to fight against the Hebrews. They're going to fight against Israel. And here they have 600 Israelites in their group. And Achish said to the commander of the Philistines, is this not David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who has been with me these days, or rather these years, and I have found no fault in him from the day he deserted to me to this day. And so basically the commanders talk to Achish and say, hey, Achish, what are these Hebrew people doing here? And basically he said, oh, it's David. Remember David, he's fleeing from his master. He's an enemy of Saul. And so therefore Achish is assuming that since he's an enemy of Saul, that David would go out and fight against Israel and fight on the side of the Philistines. Now, this doesn't tell us what David was going to do, but we're pretty sure that David was not going to fight against the Israelites. He was probably going to ambush the Philistines from the back, especially since he was in the rear. But the commanders didn't want him there because that's exactly what they were afraid of. But Achish was saying, David's been with me for over a year. I believe he was with him for like a year and a half. And so that's why he says years, because it includes more than 1 year. And so it says, this is not David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who has been with me these days, or rather these years, and I have found no fault in him from the day he deserted to me to this day. So when David first went over and Achish took him under his wing and gave him a city, remember he gave him a city, that David would go out and make raids. And when he would make raids, as I pointed out already before, he would make raids against the pockets of resistance that were in Israel that had been there and were supposed to be destroyed. And so even though he might have gone into the areas of Israel or close by, he wasn't fighting Israel, he was fighting against those pockets of resistance. And nobody knew that he was doing that because his men certainly wouldn't say anything. And not only that, but the fact is he wouldn't leave anybody alive to go and tell them. And you might say, wow, that's terrible, killing women and children. But what you have to remember is these are the same women and children that were supposed to be executed like 400 years earlier when they came into the land of Canaan. And so they were still considered the enemies of God, even though they lived among them in these pockets of resistance. And so David is taking care of those people now at this time. And as he does that, the Philistine commander Achish is assuming that David is raiding against Israel and therefore is making himself odious to Israel and giving himself a bad reputation, which is why he wants David to come and fight with him, because he knows that David has been doing this, or at least he assumes that's what David's been doing. Now, Verse 4 says, but the commander of the Philistines were angry with him, and the commanders of the Philistines said to him, make the man go back, that he may return to his place where you have assigned him, and do not let him go down to battle with us, or in the battle he may become an adversary to us. For with what could this man make himself acceptable to the Lord? Would it not be with the heads of these men? And so basically what they're saying is, if David did want to get in good with Israel again, the best way to do it, since he's going into battle, would be to fight against us and kill us. And that way, when he kills us, Israel would accept him. And they're assuming that Saul would accept him. And therefore, Saul would accept him. And David would then, rather than fighting with the Philistines, would fight against the Philistines. And so that's what they were afraid of. And so that's the reason they didn't want him to come. Now, they also say, isn't this the David of whom they sang in the dance, is saying Saul has slain his 1,000 and David is 10,000? So David's reputation got around that he was the one who killed 10,000 Philistines. And so no doubt when David was with them, he was kind of a symbol, you might say, that the Philistines had defeated Israel, because David, their champion, you might say, is now on their side. And so that's probably the reason why that they had allowed him to stay with them, because of that appearance. But many of the commanders still weren't totally convinced of David. And not only that, but they didn't want to give David an opportunity to get in good with Saul and Israel again by fighting against the Philistines instead of fighting with the Philistines. And so basically that's what they were saying. Now, Achish, however, in verse 6 says, then Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives, you have been upright, and you're going out and you're coming in with me in the army are pleasing in my sight. For I have not found evil in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, you are not pleasing in the sight of the Lord. So the Achish basically tells David, as I just read, that Achish is pleased with him, that Achish hasn't seen anything wrong in David since David had been with him, and since he's been, part of his army, that he's found no evil in him. And so, as far as he's concerned, David could stay, but the lords of the Philistines don't want him to stay. Now, talking about the lords of the Philistines, if you remember when the Ark of the Covenant was taken many years before, that God brought tumors on the Philistines because they had the Ark of the Covenant. And you remember when they sent the Ark back, that each lord gave them a golden mouse, I think, and some golden tumors as a payment for forgiveness. And so those are the lords that are under consideration here. They're city lords, and each of those city lords would have their own standing army. And so basically, those are the lords who don't want David fighting with them. Now, Achish would allow him, but the other lords wouldn't. Now, verse 7 says, now therefore return and go in peace, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines. So basically, Achish tells David that he has to go because certainly we don't want to get the commanders upset of the Philistines, the commanders upset. And so David, in verse 8, I find this interesting. David says to Achish, but what have I done? And what have you found in your servants, in your servant from the day when I came before you to this day, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord, the king? So basically, David says, what have I done? What have you found in me? Have you heard a report, or is somebody saying something that makes you not trust me? And of course, it's interesting that David says that because nobody knows what David's been doing. They're just assuming that he's been fighting for the Philistines in the different raids that he makes in various places. Now, in verse 9, it says, but Achish replied to David, I know that you are pleasing in my sight, like an angel of God. Now, one of the other things I want to tell you is when they talk about God and when they talk about Lord, their Lord, they're not talking about the God of Israel. They're talking about Dagon, which is their God, and they had their own God. And so when he talks about an angel of God, he's not talking about an angel of Jehovah or an angel of Yahweh. He's talking about an angel of Dagon, their God that they worship. So remember that as you read this, as the Philistines talk about their God, they're talking about their idol, that we, of course, know is no God, and which was proved when they had the Ark of the Covenant, and Dagon was found fallen before it 2 different times, and the last time his head and his hands were cut off. But anyway, so he says, I know that you are pleasing in my sight like an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commander of the Philistines have said he must not go up with us to the battle. So Achish basically tells David, they don't want you to come, and so you need to leave. Now, verse 10. Now then, arise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who have come with you, and as soon as you have arisen early in the morning and have light, depart. So basically he says, well, you can't stay here, you have to go, and you can't fight with us. Get up early tomorrow and go. Now verse 11. So David arose early in his men to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So here the Philistines are going to fight. David is dismissed from fighting with them, and they actually want him to stay in Philistia. And so they send him back home, and that's where we pick him up in chapter 30. In chapter 30, we notice now what happens as David was over with the Philistine commander. So let me see if we can kind of put this together, because a number of things are happening at the same time. Saul is going to the witch at Endor. David has presented himself to go into battle against against Israel, of whom Saul is trying to find a answer from God as to whether he should go up and fight against the Philistines, but God isn't answering, which is why he goes to the medium of Endor. And David is there with his men getting ready to march out in order to fight against Israel, but he's sent home. In the meantime, while he's there, something is happening at his city. That is the city that the Philistines gave him. Something is happening there that we're going to read about now. So this isn't happening after the other things. This is happening concurrently with those other 2 chapters. I mean, it might be a little bit off, hours or whatever, but it's happening at the same time. And that's what you need to see. So Saul went to the witch at Endor to find out about fighting against the Philistines. David had presented himself and was told to go home. And now let's see what happens at David's home while he was there presenting himself with the Philistines. In 1 Samuel 30, verse 1, it says, then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the 3rd day that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag, and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. And they took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carrying them off, and went their way. Then David and his men came to the city. Behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Now David's 2 wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam, the Jezreelite, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him, for all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord, his God. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, please bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this band till I overtake them? And he said to him, pursue, for you will surely overtake them, and you will surely rescue all. So David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and came to the border of Besor, where those left behind remained. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor, remained behind. Now they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David and gave him bread, and he ate, and they provided him water to drink. Now, I want to go ahead and stop there because I want to come up here and I want to point out a couple things as we begin to read this. And that is, here's David, and David is certainly doing something good for God, or at least we're assuming that David is not actually going to go fight with the Philistines, but that David will fight against the Philistines, or if nothing else, David will, pretend to fight against Israel, but we know that he's not going to fight against Israel. But he did go to present himself. And so you kind of wonder why this happened over here in chapter 30. But I think maybe we can learn some things from it. And that is, one of the things that we can learn is, just because we're doing God's will, or just because we're doing what God would want us to do, doesn't mean that bad things aren't going to happen to us. Bad things are going to happen to us. There's many people, for example, that go to church on Sundays, and their neighbors know they go on to church on Sundays, and they'll come and break into their house. And that you might say, well, why doesn't God take care of them? And why doesn't God provide for them? Because they're trying to serve him. And so one of the things that this teaches us is that maybe in reality, God is taking care of us. Well, actually he is. But I mean, even when we look at this and we think this is bad, God is still taking care of them. And God is doing it not by controlling the men who want to do evil, but by keeping them from doing that which would be of grave injury to his people. And so it's interesting that that's what we have here. So in verse 1 of chapter 30, it says, then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day. So it was the third day. That probably meant that they traveled one day to present themselves to the Philistine commanders. They stayed that day because they had been told that they couldn't go, or they stayed the next day. Then on the third day, they were coming back. So they're coming back on the third day. And it says that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag, and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. Now, Ziklag was the city that Achish had given to David to live with his 600 men. And so not only did the men live there, but they also brought all their wives and all their supplies, and it was basically their town. And so they had all the comforts of home there in Ziklag, with their wives, their children, their herds, their cattle, their produce, their business, everything was there. But it says that the Amalekites came and they made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag, and they overthrew Ziklag and burned it with fire. Now, the Amalekites were kind of like wandering marauders. And so they would go from one place to another, fighting against whatever city and taking their resources and taking their items from them. And that's basically the way they would, you might say, make their living. And so that's what they're doing here. And so as they're fighting against the Negev, which is the south area, that's where Ziklag is. So they come and fight against it, and they burn it with fire. Now, verse 2 says, and they took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. Now, remember that the 600 men were with David, and apparently they didn't leave enough of a force there in order to protect the people. Excuse me. In order to protect the people in case of an invasion. And so that's the reason they fell. That might also be the reason why the men, when this happened, David's men, were a little irked at David and were upset with him. But it says that the Amalekites took captive the women and all who were in it. So that would include their children and any of the men that they happened to leave, or any young men that happened to be there that weren't soldiers, or old men that couldn't fight. They would have taken all of them. But what's interesting, it says, without killing anyone. So they took a whole city and didn't kill anyone. And they carried them off and went their way. Now, David and the men, when they come, they don't know that no one was dead. They don't know that nobody was killed. For all they know, all of them were killed. For all they know, half of them were killed. They have no idea. Remember that this is being written after it happened, so we're getting the privilege of knowing what happened, but David doesn't. And you need to remember that as we read the next part of this. It says in verse 3, when David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. Now, David comes, he comes to the city, and it's been burned down. So they know that it's been captured, and they look for their wives, and look for their sons, their daughters, and none of them are there. There's nothing left in the city except burned ruins. And verse 4, it says, then David and the people who were with him lifted their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Now, let me suggest to you that one of the things that this is teaching us is what you and I often refer to as providence. And sometimes people say, well, what's providence? Well, providence is basically God seeing what we're going to need and answering it or preparing it even before we need it, even before we realize what we're going to need. Now, these men, as far as they're concerned, some of their wives and maybe all of their wives and all their children, maybe they've all been killed and their bodies, carried off, or maybe they've been taken captive and then they kill them on the way, or maybe abuse them, or whatever soldiers would do to captive slaves, mistreat them, harm them, do any of those normal things that they would do. And so David's men are weeping, and they lifted up their voice until there was no strength. And certainly, they were, you might say, complaining to God and telling God about, they're out trying to do what God says and be an asset to Israel by probably fighting against the Philistines. And here these things happen to them while they're gone. Now, so that you understand that it wasn't just the men who lost something. It says in verse 5, now David's two wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam, the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite. So David also had his, wives taken and the children that might have been with him if he had children at this time. And so David had lost, just like everybody else lost. David wasn't immune to the tragedy that happened. But what's interesting about the providence is that God made sure that none of these people were killed, so that when David would ask, should we go and take them back, God could tell him, yes, you're going to get them all back. And so God saw what David was going to ask and what David was going to need and what the people were going to want, who were his people. And in his providence, he designed it to where they were going to be able to get everything back that they had lost. And it's interesting, at least, and it doesn't happen in every case, don't misunderstand me. In many cases, there is loss that is suffered. And there was loss here. Their houses were burned. Their city was destroyed. So there was some loss, but not of what really mattered, not of what was really valuable to them. They were going to get it all back through the providence of God. And it kind of reminds me of one time when we got our house broken into, and and they robbed everything. They took some rifles we had. They took some computers we had. They took stuff, and of course, as always, people feel violated and unsecure. But a couple of weeks later, which was really rare, the police recovered almost everything that was stolen, and we got it all back. I got my rifle back a couple of rifles back that my father had given me when I used to live in Texas and would go hunting. And we got back our computers, and God basically gave us the important things that we needed and that we thought was important, and He allowed us to get those back. And that doesn't happen all the time. And like I said, even for Christians, it doesn't happen all the time. But I think that's part of the providence of God, and that's what you see here. And so providence is just God acting before things happen, so that we get what it is that we think that we might need. Now, verse 6 says, moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. For all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord. So the men, who, by the way, don't know about the condition of their families, were mad at David. They might be mad at David because he didn't leave, 200 men there to take care of the city while the other men went to go fight. They might be upset with him because he went, and to begin with, when he was called by Achish, there's a few reasons why they might be upset with David. And then, of course, they're just simply upset because their family's gone, and so they're distraught, and they want to blame somebody. And so they're embittered because of him. Now, what we find is what makes David different. I mean, one of the things that makes David different from King Saul, and that is that David, no matter how it looks, strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Now, the idea of strengthening himself in the Lord his God basically means that David acted in such a way where he was going to put his trust in what God said. That's the idea of strengthening himself in the Lord. In other words, even though it looked bad, even though his family had been taken and their city burned, David was going to rely on what the Lord wanted him to do, on the strength of the Lord. And that kind of verse, or that similar idea, is found for us over here in Ephesians chapter 6, where at the end of the book, or near the end of the book, where God talks about the whole armor of God, he says in Ephesians 6 and verse 10, finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Now, the idea of being strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might in the book of Ephesians is that God's people are going to put on the character that God mentioned in the book of Ephesians. For example, in Ephesians chapter 5, if you're going to be strengthened in the Lord, then you are going to, and you're a wife, then you're going to submit to your husband. If you're a husband, you're going to love your wife. If you are a child, you're going to obey your parents. You're going to honor your parents. If you're a parent, you're going to raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. If you're a slave, you're going to be obedient to your master. If you're the owner of slaves, you're going to treat them as God would want you to treat them. So the idea of being strengthened in the Lord and being strong in the Lord is that you trust in what God said. Everybody else wanted to stone David. Everybody else wanted to blame somebody, but David is trusting the Lord. And basically what that means is that if the Lord wanted David's family dead, and if the Lord wanted that invasion to happen, then the Lord has every right to do it. And David is going to simply trust what the Lord says. But David is now going to continue to trust in the Lord, because not only is he going to accept what happened, but he's also, as coming from the Lord, because everything that happens, in reality, because God either allows it, or God he allows it, permits it, or he wants it to happen. And so David has strengthened himself in the Lord, and he's also going to ask God if he should go and do anything about it. And that's the idea of being strengthened in the Lord. So being strengthened in the Lord is not some kind of supernatural thing that happens to us. Being strengthened in the Lord is simply the idea of trusting in God and trusting what he says, and trusting what God wants us to do. There are numbers of Psalms that deal with the idea of being strengthened in the Lord. There's a number of Psalms that deal with that, where David talks about trusting in the Lord. One of them, I believe, is Psalms 31. Yeah, you have like one of them. And basically it starts off and says, in you, O Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be ashamed. In your righteousness, deliver me. Incline your ear to me. Rescue me quickly. Be to me a rock of strength, a stronghold to save me. For you are my rock and my fortress. For your name's sake, you will lead me and guide me. And so that's the idea of David being strengthened by the Lord and strengthened in the Lord. He's his rock and his stronghold. And like I pointed out, there's many passages that indicate that God is our stronghold. In Psalms 18 and verse 1 and 2, it says, I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. So just like David is going to trust the Lord and trust that God knows what he's doing with his life, so that wife would submit to her husband, and that husband would love his wife, and those children would honor their parents, and slaves would work hard for their masters, and it's basically, contrary to what the world would do and how the world would react. But we're not putting our strength in the world, we're putting our strength in the Lord. And so you have a number of those kind of passages where that happens, and where he talks about it in Psalm 62 and verse 7. O God, my salvation and my glory rest. The rock of my strength, my refuge is in God. And so basically, David is trusting God. He's going to trust God even to the point where you might think it's kind of silly or it's kind of funny that David asks of God, should I go get them? You might think, of course you should go get them. I mean, they're your family. You should go rescue them. Maybe you'll find somebody alive. David doesn't know if they're all alive. David doesn't know if they're all dead. David doesn't know anything except that they were taken captive, and and their bodies aren't there in the city, but the city's burned down. And so he doesn't know what to think. And so you might think to yourself, well, of course you go out and you run those people down and find them and get those people back, because that's what a normal person would do. Just like a normal person who has an enemy that's after him, if he had an opportunity to kill him, then a normal person would kill his enemy, especially if he thought God gave him the opportunity to do that. But David doesn't do that. David's strength is not in David. David's strength is in the Lord. David is going to trust the Lord, even to the point where he's going to find out from God if he should do anything about this or just let it be. And whatever God tells him is what David's going to do. And so that's the idea that's under consideration here. And that's what I want you to see here, that David has strengthened himself in the Lord. Maybe the men, David's men were saying, well, we have to go get these people, let's go fight against them. They're mad at David. And so maybe they want to take matters into their own hands. I don't know. And so they're embittered against him because they're sons and their daughters. And certainly you can understand that. But David's going to find out what God wants him to do. Even in this matter, verse 7, it says, then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, please bring me the ephod. Now remember, the ephod was that breast piece that went over the breast piece of the high priest. And it was basically the way God communicated with them. And so Abiathar brought the ephod to David, so that David could inquire of the Lord. And this is the difference between Saul and David. God is still talking with God is still talking with David. He's not talking with Saul anymore. And David doesn't have to go find a medium or a witch in order to talk to God. God is talking to David through the ephod and through the normal means that the priest would have or the prophet would have, and God is talking with him. And that's what we need to remember also, is that we can't make God talk to us. God talks to us if he so desires, but he has given us the word that teaches us what he wants us to do. And so he says, so Abiathar brought the ephod to David. And David inquired in verse 8, David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? And he said to him, pursue, for you will surely overtake them, and you will surely rescue all. And so right there is the very first time that it appears that everybody will be rescued. And certainly that's what the people wanted. That's what the men wanted. They weren't overly concerned about the city. It wasn't theirs anyway. I mean, it was given to them, but it wasn't theirs. It was in Philistine territory, and they weren't going to live there for the rest of their lives. It was just a temporary place for them to stay. So that wasn't their real concern. Their real concern was their family. That's their real concern. Not even their property or possessions was their so much their concern, as much as it was their sons and their daughters. That's what they're concerned about. And we need to remember that too. There's a lot of things in this life that take us away from our sons and our daughters and our family and our wives. And here they were taken by force. But the worse than that is sometimes we freely give up our wives and our children for the sake of making more money, or for the sake of becoming successful, or for the sake of our own benefit. Some people have abortions and they kill their child so that the child won't be a burden to them. Some people leave their children with relatives and let the relatives raise them. Many times people don't see their children and their wives and their family as important, and yet that's really what's important in life, because those individuals are the ones who have or will have or can have eternal life. They're the ones who have the image of God in them. And one of them is more important than all the world. And that's why Jesus said about the fact that, what does it profit a man to lose his own soul and gain the whole world? If you lose your soul and you gain the whole world, Jesus says it's not a profit. You don't profit. You're actually losing, because what's important is not the possessions of the world. What's important is your soul. And so the men were worried about their families. And here's the very first time that it seems, if they listen properly, that they would have some hope, because it says that you're going to rescue them all. And so they might have some hope here. Now, verse 9 says, so David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook of Besor, where those left behind remained. Now, what that means is you have to remember that David had just marched all the way from where he presented himself to the Philistines. They marched all that day to finally get to Ziklag, their town. When they get there, it's burned and destroyed. And so now they're immediately turning around, and now they're marching out again. And so the 600 men march out again to go out. And it's been such a long, arduous process that 200 of the men are fatigued and they're exhausted to the point where they're really not going to be able to fight if they continue with David. And so they're left behind at the brook Besor. And so that's what we have here. And this is important because we're going to notice a principle that God has for us that I think that we need to understand here. Now, verse 11 says, now they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David and gave him bread, and he ate. And they provided him water to drink. And they gave him a piece of fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, and he ate. And then his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said to him, to whom do you belong? And where are you from? And he said, I am a young man of Egypt, a servant of an Amalekite. And my master left me behind when I fell sick 3 days ago. We made a raid on the Negev of the Cherethites, and on that which belongs to Judah, and on the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. Then David said to him, will you bring me down to this band? And he said, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will bring you down to this band. So the men, 200 men stay at the brook Bezor. The other 400 men proceed. And as they proceed, they find an Egyptian. And this Egyptian is in the field. And, he's probably wandering around, or else maybe he's exhausted, starving, you might say. But anyway, they come across him, and David finds him. And then again, just to show you the providence of God, they needed this Egyptian in order to direct them to where the Amalekites were, in order so they might be able to go and rescue everybody that's there. And so again, we see the providence of God in providing somebody who could lead them. And so this Egyptian, they gave him some bread and he ate, and they provided him water to drink because apparently he hadn't eaten for a couple of days. And they gave him a piece of fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, and he ate. And then his spirit revived. So basically he was famished, and he'd been left for 3 days, apparently without food and apparently without water. And his master probably left him thinking he was going to die, or maybe that his master didn't want him to infect anybody else. So he, threw him out, because anyway, he was a slave. They got him in Egypt, and he was a slave. When he says a servant, he means a slave. So he's been a slave of the Amalekites. So he's probably not someone who is too keen on the Amalekites, especially now that his master just deserted him, abandoned him, and left him for dead. Certainly he would have a little bit of resentment towards his master. But it says, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. So you can imagine how hungry and exhausted and thirsty he was. And so it says, and David said to him, to whom do you belong? And where are you from? And he said, I'm the young man of Egypt. In other words, they had captured him from Egypt. He's a servant of an Amalekite. He is a slave. And my master, that's why he says, master left me behind when I fell sick 3 days ago. So as I pointed out, his master might have thought he was going to infect people, or he was contagious, or actually just didn't want to take the trouble with him, which is what they would do with individuals when they lost their productivity. They would just leave them out somewhere in order to die and leave them there. And so that's what happened with him. And so he was left there. And so he says, the servant says, we made a raid on the Negev and of the Cherethites, and on that which belonged to Judah, and on the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And so these areas, all 3 of these areas, are areas of Judah. And so, like I said, the Amalekites, they run around making raids and destroying little cities and taking everything that belongs to them, and then moving on. They're kind of like locusts, you might say. And so that's what they had done to the Cherethites and to Caleb, the south of Caleb, and to Ziklag. They burned it and took everybody with fire. Verse 15 says, then David said to him, will you bring me down to this band? And he said, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will bring you down to this band. And so basically he says, can you get us to where we need to go? And he said, yes, I can, and I can help you. And so that's where we're going to stop today, because our time is up. And I hope that God has blessed you, and I hope that God continues to bless you as you learn more about him and as you strive to serve him and do his will. Because that's the only thing that we want, or I want from you, is that you serve the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, because he's the one who gives us life and can bless us. And to him belongs all praise and glory. So pray God blesses you.